What is going on, y'all? I am KM Best, and one of my friends, Torikun, managed to qualify for the $5,000 ER Marvel Snappers Assemble tournament in Hong Kong, playing a really interesting take on High Evolutionary Moon Girl. So, if you want to crush your opponent's dreams on the final turn of the game and have control over when that final turn happens, check this one out.
All right.
Torikun, welcome to the YouTube channel. This is the list you used basically through the entire ER Esports $5,000 bracket. Now you're in the top four with a plane ticket to Hong Kong in your pocket because of this list. So can you give me a little bit of background on what this list is trying to do and how you ended up on it as a way of combating this metagame?
So this is the High Evo Moon Girl She-Hulk deck. Basically, it was conceptualized by Jeet Jet, as you may know, another player from the Philippines who I greatly respect. And it was used back then to reach a top two in one of the Snap Battle arenas, followed by absolutely crushing the Snap Fan July Open with 11-0 run. Absolutely insane by Jet there, and I've proceeded to take the deck for myself. And this is a deck that I played a lot during the ER tournament. So what this tries to do is leverage the power of Moon Girl to double She-Hulk, and you have Magic as well to give you an extra turn, and you essentially build up to one of the most powerful turn 7s in the game, which is you Moon Girl into double She-Hulk because you passed on turn 6, and then you drop a Hulk, and that's just an insane amount of power that you can divide pretty nicely as well and react to your opponent's plays. This deck is incredibly strong in the meta right now, and yeah, I'm pretty happy with its performance for me.
So before we jump into card by card, there are a couple matchups that I just want to get your impression of, right? So what is your impression of how the Darkhawk matchup tends to go for you? What are the cards you pay attention to? I do notice there is an Echo in here. I assume that on some level that is deference to Darkhawk. On some level, it at least helps there. So what is your impression of how that matchup goes?
Yeah. So I think we're actually kind of favored into Darkhawk, believe it or not, because the cards we play are just bigger than the tech cards, and the tech cards don't really have a target in our deck between the armor and the Cosmo, preventing our big Hulks from getting Shang-Chi'd. Echo also helps. I have sniped a few Zabus in my time with this deck using Echo, but the real thing you have to watch out for when playing against the Darkhawk decks is Legion, because
Yeah.
Legion blowing up Limbo on turn 6, not even Cosmo can prevent that from happening. So you're oftentimes going to have to play very differently. But even without Limbo going off, if you just have double She-Hulks on turn 6, that's just often just much bigger than what your opponent can do, especially if you play Echo, Armor, Cosmo correctly. And even Cyclops, even Sunspot, just floating over and over can just be very, very annoying for that deck to deal with.
Okay, so another deck I wanted to ask you about, yet another Legion deck, but probably a little bit of a worse matchup would be the Move deck, because they are just a lot more able to get out ahead early. They have the Captain Marvel to alleviate this, or the problems this deck causes in terms of having to pick lanes. So what is your impression of that matchup, especially now that it's been rising to prominence?
Yeah. Personally, I haven't actually played against that matchup like throughout the entire ER tournament.
Yeah.
I'm terrified of that deck because I think it's a lot stronger and a lot worse of a matchup than Darkhawk. You're correct there. And really, it's pretty much about player skill, and just like you have to skill diff them with getting insane Moon Girl draws, because I think you're more dependent on it, because otherwise you won't be able to scale out harder than what Craven can output. But it's not. It's still a deck that I have to play against a bit more with this personally. But yeah, I'm a lot scared. I'm a lot more scared of it. So if I have to say something that puts this deck in our favor, we are very good at going very tall in 2 lanes, especially.
Yes.
So if you can set it up properly, then you might be able to go over the top.
So one thing I did want to mention, because like we've talked about, an iffy matchup and a potentially bad one. One thing I did want to mention, though, is that this deck, unlike either of those other 2 decks, is actually 100% equipped to deal with Nimrod in a way that basically very few other decks you could reasonably play into an open field are. With the armor, with the Cosmo, we are probably the best anti-Nimrod deck that is still a real deck. And that isn't just like, let's throw armor into something else. Like, this is something that works proactively for us and against our opponents when they're playing stuff like Nimrod Shuri. So I did want to counterbalance that point with the other one. Like, there are some real upsides to playing a list like this because of Armor Cosmo. It honestly reminds me a little bit of old Shuri, right? Where old
Definitely.
Shuri just had Armor and Cosmo and did really big numbers, and just having those cards in your deck is enough in the right metas alongside some real numbers. Like, that's what this deck reminds me of, is old Shuri.
Yep. I think that's honestly pretty apt because your power turn is turn 4 with the Moon Girls. I think it's a little bit more flexible than old Shuri was just because of the presence of the buffed magic. So you're not necessarily required to have Moon Girl on 4 as much compared to having Shuri on 4 back in the old days. So you can like magic on 3, Moon Girl on 4, and you're still able to explode in your later turns. So in that regard, yeah, it's similar to Shuri, but a bit different. And yeah, that's what I'm gonna add.
All right, let's move on to some specific card choices here. I want to start with Echo, because this is a debated slot. We have Echo or Quinjet usually, right? So what made you opt for Echo?
Yeah, so Echo, this slot was originally Quinjet beforehand, but it's also like the thing with Quinjet is like I've seen and played with a few of the other Jeet Moon Girl decks. He played like a Khazar, a Quinjet list before settling on this in the current metagame. And with regards to Quinjet, the problem with it is like the best cards you want to duplicate with it are She-Hulk and maybe like some of the 1-drops, but the 1-drops don't get discounted. If She-Hulk gets discounted, you're still only able to play like a She-Hulk for 1 and then a She-Hulk for 0, but like that's not a complete discount either. You can't play Hulk after. So you end up looking for a card that does better, and Echo is just really annoying actually. We already play Cosmo, and one thing that this deck gets that is really annoying is a Echo plus Cosmo just completely shuts down a lane by itself, honestly. Like how many cards, like it becomes kind of like a deep space in a way, and there are not a lot of decks that are equipped to deal with that as well. Echo also helps your matchup into a bunch of Thanos decks, helps against Darkhawk, so I think it's a very useful card. Even if you're not necessarily sniping something, you just play it proactively and you can more easily predict where your opponent's going to go.
Let's move on to Jeff. I know everyone is going to ask, like the number one question on this video is going to be replacement for Echo and then replacement for Jeff. So let's talk about, we already talked about, you can play Quinjet if you don't want to play Echo. What can you play if you don't want to play Jeff?
So, like, that's a great question, and one I had to answer myself because for the quarterfinals, we had to submit 2 deck lists, and I submitted this deck list, and then I submitted another deck list, but I wanted to play Jeff in that one, and we're not allowed to play duplicates. So I needed to find a replacement. I settled on Shocker, and Jeff is there because he is probably the most flexible 2-drop in a deck that prides itself on the flexibility of cards with Moon Girl. It kind of fits also helps against Thanos. But Shocker isn't bad. I've played against a bunch of Shocker and played a decent amount with it. It can be quite annoying because it's a black box. You can't really tell what Shocker is, what Shocker hits. Like, and sometimes you will high roll, you'll hit the Moon Girl. Sometimes you'll hit the Hulk, and you'll just like blow your opponent out. And Jeff is definitely more consistent, but Shocker is the high roll, the more high rolly card.
Gotcha. I want to talk about two cards that are not in the list. The first is America Chavez. What led to your decision to not run America Chavez in a deck that seems so dependent on playing your 4-cost card on turn 4?
Like I said, you're not really dependent on playing Moon Girl on 4. You can play it on 5 as well with Magic. I've recently been trying Chavez in Cyclops' slot personally. I don't think it's bad at all. Like, this is a deck that wants the 1-drops early, it wants Magic early, it wants Moon Girl early, it wants Hulk early, it wants She-Hulk early. So I think you can fit Chavez in here fine, and it'll operate just fine. Personally, I'm used to playing without her, so that might be one of the reasons. I also put Chavez in my second deck. That's why I didn't bring Chavez into this deck when I played it in ER. But also, including another card like similar to Cyclops in the deck gives you a bit more game against lockout strategies, because like Moon Girl isn't really that helpful if you draw it early, if your opponent is just gonna play Professor X, right? So the more copies of cards that in your deck that do well into lockdown, like Professor X, Storm, you improve your matchup in that regard as well. Even though you kind of lose out a bit on some other matchups, it's just evaluating what would you rather have, right?
Gotcha. And one other card that I understand why it's not in here, but I think I'll get some questions about, the Infinite.
So I don't like it personally. It's if you play Infinite, you won't really have the time to play Infinite. That's the problem. Like, essentially, the Infinite isn't even that much better than the Hulk. You lose so much flexibility for just like a consistent 20 power, when if you draw the Hulk early, you can get to 22 perhaps, or 24, depending on how the game has progressed. It's not even that much better. And essentially gives you one less card to play on turn 6, because there are games where you don't draw She-Hulk, but the Hulk just gets big enough to win by itself. 20 power is often just overkill, and you don't need it at all. That's why we're playing High Evolutionary to play Hulk. Why do we need to play Infinite?
Yep. So, do you have any tips for someone who's never played a deck like this? They just want to play it. What would you advise? How would you advise they start? What would you advise they be thinking about?
Yeah, so this is a deck where you have a lot of tools. So you want to really, from the start of the game, you want to be looking ahead, planning where every card goes, because armor can be used to protect your 1-drops, to protect your big cards. You want to play that. You want to like save a lane for armor. You just declare, I'm going to put She-Hulks there, for example. And then as well, Magic is very important. You have to understand the deck that you're playing against. Really fish out if your opponent has the ability to run Legion, if they're running like Reality Stone, Scarlet Witch, because if you're running that, if your opponent is running that, you have to be aware of it and be prepared to have to play Cosmo onto the limboed lane. It's also important to really decide early on because if you're gonna pass, because passing is the best play in a lot of turns, for a lot of turns, because you're powering up Sunspot, you're powering up Hulk, you're getting Cyclops hits, discounting She-Hulks. So you want to decide from the get-go, am I passing on turn 5? Do I have to pass on turn 6? Because you need to be able to game plan what is your big turn.
Gotcha. All right, Tori, tell them who you are. Where can they find you?
Okay. So yeah, Tori-kun Snaps on Twitter. So I post a lot. I cover a lot about of the tournament scene. And I compete in a few tournaments myself. And you can look forward to watching me. I'll be meeting KM Best in Hong Kong, competing in the ER tournament. So I'm excited to finally get to meet this man over here and compete in a bunch of big tournaments. So I also write for Snap Fan as well. So do check me out there. But yeah, I'm Tori-kun Snaps on Twitter and Discord. So do drop a follow on my Twitter.
Tori, thank you so much for coming on. I will see you in the next one. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom. Have a good one.